Hey friends, it's Jessi. Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another video. Today's video I'm super excited about. We're going to be ranking all of my Nomad Cosmetics palettes. Nomad Cosmetics is one of my favorite indie brands and I just love their formula. I love their palettes. I love their concepts. They always do palettes that are based on locations. And as someone that loves travel, I'm obsessed with their whole vibe. So if you want to see where all of my Nomad palettes rank, then just keep watching. For today's look, I actually did the whole look using different Nomad palettes. So the first palette I used was the Tokyo palette. I just went into this purple red shifty shade and I just did that all over the lid. I also reached into my Costa Rica palette and I used the pink and the purple in this palette just to do the pink and purple. And of course I couldn't do a pink and purple look without tapping into the Verona palette for some of those really beautiful pink shades. So this look was just kind of a hodgepodge of different palettes today, but I really like how it turned out. It turned out beautiful, but let's go ahead and jump into my ranking. I have 11 different palettes to talk about today, and I ranked them based off of color story, quality, and overall just how much I use the palette. There are some palettes that you will see that I really like the color story of, but I just don't reach for them, and vice versa. Ones that maybe aren't my favorite color stories ranked a little bit higher because I do use them more, and I feel like the quality is a little bit better. Without further ado, coming in at number 11 is my America's Parks palette. This is one of the older Nomad palettes. I'm fairly certain they do not make this palette anymore. It's been discontinued. This color story is just gorgeous, and it by no means is a bad palette. It is still a great palette. None of these are bad palettes. They are all wins. But someone had to be in the bottom, and this color story, as beautiful as it is, I just don't reach for this palette a lot because I feel like the shimmers in here are not my favorite. This middle row right here, I just am not a fan of any of those shimmers. I like the concept of the marble shades and I really want to love them, but unfortunately I just feel like I'm not a huge fan. They look more exciting than they are on the eye. The two shimmers in the bottom row are probably the only two that I actually really enjoy using, and those are both kind of more neutral shimmers. Even these two shimmers up here, the yellow and the teal, just aren't my favorite, but I do really like the quality of the mattes. I like the overall color story, and the theming is really fun. I live in Utah, and so to be able to look at this and see some of the different landmarks near where I live is really cool, but I just don't reach for this palette as a whole. Coming in at number 10, we have the Whistler Snow Lodge palette. This one may be a little shocking. I love, 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 love the colors in this one. I think the color story, phenomenal. One of the coolest color stories I've seen from a brand. I love the colors. I don't even know what it is about this, but when I look at this color story, I just get so inspired and so excited, but I just never reach for it. There's nothing bad about the quality. I love the mattes. Nomad does mattes really, really great. And even the shimmers are really nice. This is like almost like a duochrome. It's like a blue to purple shift. The only reason this is ranking so low is because I don't think I've used it enough to rank it any higher and feel justified. I would feel bad ranking this any higher when honestly I have not used every shade in this palette. The rest of the palettes I've used every shade. I enjoy every shade. I just haven't reached for this one. So it is ranked number 10, but I do want to pull this one out maybe in the winter time and get some reuse out of this beautiful palette. Coming in at number 9 is my Tokyo palette. This is one of the first palettes that I saw from Nomad. This is kind of when I started getting on the Nomad hype train. It is just a beautiful pastel palette. I love the color story. It's colorful, it's fun. Each row has a different finish. So this top row is mattes, this middle row is more satin shades, and this bottom row has these really cool shifty shades. Like I said, I used this corner shade today on my eyes and it looks very purple in the camera, but I promise it has that pinky red reflect. It is beautiful. I really like this palette. The quality is great. The color story is great. The only reason I'm ranking it so low is honestly because I just don't reach for pastels all that often. And there are more colorful palettes in this pile that I reach for more often. So this one did unfortunately get put at the bottom of the pile. Coming in at number 8 is another colorful palette. This is the Paradise Islands palette. I love the theme in this one. It is beautiful. It screams tropical paradise to me. I really like the color story in this one as well. I feel like this is kind of similar to the Tokyo palette where you have some of those more pastel shades, but this one does have a little bit more of those punchy colors with these neon greens and these teals. I like this palette a lot. I find that I reach for it quite often, but I don't feel like when I want to reach for this palette, I reach for it just for this palette. I usually reach in for specific shades. Like if I'm doing an orange look, I might reach into some of these oranges. If I'm doing a blue look, I might reach into one of these blues or the teal. I don't really feel like I use this one a lot on its own, and that is why it's ranking more towards the middle, because I just don't use it on its own. That's just not how I use it. I always use it in conjunction with something else. I feel like I haven't used it on its own since I've gotten it, but I have no issues with this formula as well. These mattes do have an interesting formula to them. They're kind of more of that cream to powder formula, and I personally have more of a preference towards powder mattes versus cream to powder shades. But other than that, I love everything about this palette. I think it's great. I especially love the shimmery metallic shades in this palette because they are that softer Super Shock type formula, so they just glide on super easy. But this is the Paradise palette. Number 7 is gonna shock y'all because when I reviewed this palette on my channel, I gave it raving reviews, and I still love this palette. This is the Verona palette. When I film my rankings, I actually rank my palettes first into 3 different piles, and then I rank within those piles just to break it up for myself. So at the top, I have absolute favorites, and then we have middle ground where I like them, but they're not least favorites. And then if I had to, for whatever reason, declutter some of these palettes, these are the ones that I would declutter first. That is my bottom pile. So this one actually ranked towards the middle because as I was ranking them, I realized that as much as I love this palette, I guess there's palettes I love more. This is so cute. I love the color story. This is one of my favorite color stories from Nomad. But the thing about this one that really gets me is the shimmers. Right when this palette came out, I know a lot of people were actually getting replacement palettes because they felt like the shimmers just weren't very great quality. And I do feel like my shimmers are very hard pressed. I will be honest, I feel like the shimmers in this are some of the hardest pressed shimmers Nomad has done, but I do really like the mattes. I also don't love that they're topper shades. I believe this top middle shade and this light blue shade are more toppery shades, and I just am not a fan of toppers. I just don't really use them. If I'm doing a sparkly lid, I want something that's going to be sparkly on its own. I don't want to have to layer a topper to really get that impact, but as a whole, I do really like the color story. The mattes are great. I feel like the mattes blend super well, but the shimmers are kind of what has put me off of this palette a little bit. I do continue to reach for this one quite regularly. Since I reviewed this palette and did my 3 looks video, I regularly reach for this palette. I just feel like with my preferences, I like some of the other palettes more. Number 6 is a newer palette. This is the Okavango Safari palette. This one has that beautiful luxe velvety cover. It really gives like ABH Soft Glam vibes. This is what the inside looks like. It is neutrals with some green pops. And I do really like this palette. I actually enjoyed this palette a lot more than I thought I was going to enjoy it. I love the quality of the mattes in this one. I feel like the mattes in here are super buttery, super easy to work with, and I do like most of the shimmers. I still am a little put off by the shimmers that have the marbling in it, like the tiger stripes and the zebra stripes, and this one's kind of like a crocodile pattern. I don't really like those, but I do love the rest of the metallics, especially this one right here. This is just such a beautiful blinding bronze shimmer. And I do like the depth of this palette. I love when a palette has some contrast to it, so where it can go pretty light, but it can also go pretty dark. And I feel like this is a great example of you have pretty light and you also have pretty dark in this palette. The reason this one is ranking so high is because after I got this palette and I reviewed it, I did my 3 looks, I kept this in my everyday makeup drawers and I continue to reach for it all the time for everyday looks. I combined it a lot with some of the panning projects that I was doing and overall got a ton of use out of this palette. I mean, some of these shades are already starting to look pretty loved and I've only had this palette a couple of months. I recently had to force myself to put this palette back so I could work on other things, but I did really enjoy using this palette and it is still one that I love to pull out. Number 5 is the Costa Rica palette. It's Monteverde, I believe is how you say it. Oh my gosh, all my palettes just almost toppled. I love this palette. I love the quality of this palette, but again, I don't feel like I use this one on its own. Today, I reached into those purpley pink shades and did my crease with that. But as a whole, I feel like unless I'm doing an all green look, I really don't reach for this one by itself, and I did want to challenge myself to pull this one out and continue to use it. I actually have been feeling super inspired by this palette, which is why it was the inspiration for my look today. I saw these two shades and I was like, I'm just gonna do a whole look based off of those two shades. But I love the quality of this. This to me has some of the best Nomad quality. I don't want to say they change their formula every time because I don't think that they do, but for whatever reason, the combination of pigments in this palette and the colors, it just works. It works. The quality is great. There isn't a bad shade. And these shimmers are absolutely blinding, especially like this middle shimmer right here, this green. Oh my gosh, it's so blinding. If I'm honest, I'm not a huge fan of the green as the background packaging. I feel like it just makes it feel a little green heavy. And while the majority of the shades are green, I feel like every time I pull this palette out, I see different colors. And I think of different color combinations that maybe I wouldn't have thought to try before. So this one has really pushed me outside of my comfort zone, and I have really enjoyed getting to know this palette and playing around and stretching my creative mind. So this one is ranking right in the middle. We are into my top 4. So the next 4 are all the ones that I ranked in my top favorites category. This was hard because I feel like any of these could be interchanged for each other, but at the time that I decided to do my ranking, this is kind of where they fell in my mind. So at number 4, we have the Haunted Europe palette. This is so fun. I am a huge fan of this reflective packaging. I love all things spooky, and this was the Halloween palette from I believe 2 years ago already. And look at the color story. I already have a pan in one of the shades. I have a pan in this champagne shade. I'm close to pan in this warm brown up in the corner. I just love the color story. This to me is both a Halloween palette and a fall palette, just with the variation of colors. I think the blue and green is really fun. I've done some of my favorite looks using this palette. I used this palette when Taylor Swift released Midnights, and I did my midnight release party makeup. I copied her album cover makeup using this middle row right here. It was perfect. It was chef's kiss. I was a huge fan. And while this palette is great on its own, I can also combine it with a ton of other palettes just to give myself a little bit more of a grungy feel. And I love playing with this one, especially this time of year where we're getting into fall and spooky season. I believe they're actually bringing this palette back next year. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in this palette, keeping your eye out for when they re-release it. Number 3 is another fall palette. It is the Hudson Valley palette. This one was the fall palette from last year. And as you can see, it's a bit more muted than the Haunted Europe. But the reason this one is ranking a little bit higher is because before I got the Okavango Safari palette, this was my everyday palette. I love this last row here with the cool tones. I just think they're so perfect. I've talked about it a few times, how the shade Twig from the ABH Sultry palette is my all-time favorite shadow. It is just the perfect eye contour shade for me. And this shade, Apple Cider Donut, right on the end, is a perfect dupe for that. Like, it is so good. This one is very matte heavy. You have the more cool tones on one side and more of those warmer fall shades on the other. And you really only have 3 shimmers. And those 3 shimmers are kind of that softer Super Shock formula. The shimmers in this palette are not as blinding or punchy as I prefer. I feel like I prefer right now just a really wet looking metallic. And these do give you quite a big punch. You do get a great punch of shimmer, but I feel like it's just not as blinding as I prefer. But as a whole, this is definitely a palette that I reach into a lot. It is one that I love to reach into, and I've continuously reached into over the past year. Number 2 is the newest Nomad palette in my collection, and it is the Ghost Town USA palette. Look how fun that packaging is. It is the beautiful younger sister of the Haunted Europe, and I think it is stunning. This one is very cool toned. I feel like out of all these palettes that we've looked at, this is the most cool toned out of all of them. And you do have quite a nice selection of neutrals on one side and more of those blue and green grungy shades on the other. And you do have a nice ratio of mattes to shimmers, which is a huge win for me. I love having an even mix of mattes and shimmers. I don't know why, I just prefer an even mix, but I do. That's just a thing. I know some people prefer mattes, some people prefer shimmers. I prefer an even blend 50-50. I don't know what it is, but this has that, so it automatically ranks higher. I actually debated if I wanted to rank this one so high because it is so new, and I feel like, again, because it has been so new and a lot of these other palettes I've had for at least a year, I feel like I've tried those more, but I just have been so impressed by this palette. The quality, I feel like the shimmers are very wet looking. It is that super wet foiled finish that I look for in my shimmers. The mattes are super easy to blend. This shade up here is another one of my favorite shades, kind of that cool tone taupe. And I do really like the depth in this palette. To me, this has great contrast. You have some of those really light shades. You have a really deep brown. You have a really deep blue. There's so much variety in this palette, and I haven't created the same look twice when I've used this. I've always done a different look every single time I've pulled this out. Oh, you also have this cute little duochrome down here. It's like a gold and purple reflect. So this palette, I feel like, gives you a great variety of finishes, of looks, of colors, all the things. So I feel like out of all my palettes, this one is one of the more versatile palettes because I do use it for very easy, everyday, wearable makeup for work, but I also use it for my fun, crazy, colorful looks as well. So I have really enjoyed all the use I've gotten out of this one. And who knows, maybe next year when I do this, this will rank a little bit higher, but I am not ready to dethrone my #1 palette. And my #1 palette is my Provence palette. This is my baby. Out of my entire collection, if I had to pick one eyeshadow palette out of my entire collection of, how many palettes do I have? Like 200 palettes. This would be my favorite. It has this cute little picture of a French cafe, and this is the color story. I love, 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 love this color story. One of my favorite colors of eyeshadow on myself is yellow. This yellow row, stunning. And this yellow in particular, right in the middle, it's kind of a yellow with like a blue-green reflect. It is so, so beautiful on the eye. And you do have a lot of different colors in this palette. You have 5 monochromatic rows, but they're all colors that complement each other. Yellow and purple are opposite colors on the color wheel, so they look great with each other on the eye. You can also do blue and purple. You can do pink and orange. You can do pink and yellow. You can combine all 3 of these rows for a nice gradient warm look. You can kind of mix and match the blue and the red, the pink and the yellow. There are just so many combinations in this palette, and it just, every look is fire. I love to travel. One of my favorite places I've traveled has been France, and when I look at this palette, I do see France, and I see that kind of their vision that they were going for. So I have that little connection to it as well. But this is just one of those palettes that I will never get tired of, and I have had this in my everyday drawers for literally a year. I love it. I reach for it all the time. I specifically reach into this palette all the time for this yellow row. I feel like this has been one of the most well done palettes that Nomad has done, both in terms of color story, but as well as theming and location. I feel like this really, really gives France vibes. I will die on that hill that this is my favorite palette, and hopefully they don't release something to dethrone it, because I am not ready to let Miss Provence be dethroned. But that is all for today's video, my friends. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. If you have any palettes from Nomad, definitely let me know down in the comments which your favorite is. I would love to know. And with that, I will see you guys all in the next one. Bye, friends!